To the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Roy, for your leadership once again, and in particular on this all-important issue of the fiscal and economic stability of our country, but more than that, not just the financial part of it, which we cannot overstate. We can't overstate the harm being to our country from a spending standpoint, with $32 trillion in national debt, on the backs of our children or grandchildren, $100,000 per citizen. But in addition to that, how that debt and how that spending has accumulated for the purpose of literally harming the American people. How our own government has become weaponized against its own citizens, trying to control every aspect of our lives, trying to control decisions like whether or not we can use a gas stove, have or use a gas stove, whether or not we can choose what kind of car we want to drive, whether or not we can heat or cool our homes the way that we want to, whether or not we can exercise our God-given, constitutionally protected Second Amendment rights, whether or not we can make decisions for ourselves on whether or not we can operate our business, earn a living, educate our children the way that we want to without the heavy hand of government coming in. So we've got $32 trillion in national debt, $100,000 per citizen. And what is this president's response with the budget proposal that he rolls out yesterday to increase spending about 56% beyond where it was pre-COVID? So to go from $4.4 trillion in spending, this president wants to increase it by $2.5 trillion to $6.9 trillion. That $6.9 trillion, for just 1 year, mind you, is about $20,000 per American citizen. How many Americans today would vote to spend to borrow and spend, we got to put borrow in front of all of it, to borrow and spend $20,000 on their personal credit card to do things that are not only helpful to them, but much of which are harmful to them, on top of the $100,000 in national debt that we have per citizen today? Thank God for Republicans who are going to come into the gap and stand on the wall, defend the American people, and bring some stability, finally some fiscal stability to our country, and cut the spending, deal a blow against the woke, weaponized government that is assaulting and harming the American people. And we're going to do that with the opportunity that we have as we face the debt ceiling limit. We're going to utilize this opportunity of our newfound congressional House rules that are going to allow us to put reforms in place for not just this year and next year, but for the future, to put us on a path to fiscal responsibility. And Congressman Roy from Texas, I want to thank you for showing leadership once again on the most important fundamental issues for our country.
Well, I thank the gentleman from Virginia, and I thank him for his leadership. We joined together with our colleagues in the House Freedom Caucus this morning to announce what we believe is the, I'd say, bare minimum, if you will, the sort of baseline for resetting the table on how we deal with spending, and importantly, empowering the American people by shrinking Washington and growing America, because we trust the people to do it, not government. And this is an age-old debate, but this is something where Leviathan, right, this great beast, this thing we call the federal government, is growing and expanding in power in ways that should concern every American. Just yesterday in the House Judiciary Committee, there were conversations about the power of the federal government being used to chill speech, to target American citizens, to shut down their First Amendment rights. And I think about, is there anything more concerning than the power of the government being used to chill the fundamental rights given to us by our Creator, as reflected in the Bill of Rights, than what we're seeing right now? The FTC going after right now, targeting. They want to know, wait, who's involved with all of this, right? They're actually targeting journalists, targeting private citizens. Is that what the power of the government is supposed to be used for, I would ask the gentleman from Virginia.
Clearly not. And the loss of trust and confidence to the degree that it's been lost in the last 2 years in our federal government, in our election systems, in our government agencies, in even our Department of Injustice, I would call it, is just so damaging to the future of our country. How do we get that back? How do we restore it? We start by not funding it, not funding those agencies, those bureaucracies that are perpetuating such harm on the American people. And you made the point earlier today so well that we talk about going back to pre-COVID spending at $4.4 trillion. Yeah. At that point, that was record spending in the history of the country. Right. That was leading us to some, at that point, maybe $25 trillion in national debt, untold amount that we haven't had since World War II. That was the pre-COVID. That was out of hand. That was out of control. It's just this president who's taken it to a new level. $10 trillion in new spending in the first 2 years of administration has never happened before in the history of the country. But it's not just the dollars, which if this was good spending, meaning things that we thought were justified, if you will, or positive things, we don't have the money. We can't afford it. We're bankrupt. But worse than that, when we're spending money literally to make our military weaker, we're spending money literally to keep our border open to the Mexican crime cartels. We're spending money literally to harm our kids in schools. We're spending money literally to try to ruin the country. If you were setting out 2 years ago to try to ruin the country, what would you do differently than what this administration has done while borrowing the money to do it?
Yeah, I asked earlier, if you set out over the last 2 or 3 decades to do a worse job than the leadership of this country in this chamber, the Senate, the bureaucracy, and the White House, could you imagine doing a worse job than over the last 3 decades? I mean, in truth, the amount of debt that has been accumulated, right? In 2003, when I was a baby staffer for a senator on the other side of this building, the national debt was about $6 trillion.
We couldn't imagine it at that time.
Right. And it's now $26 trillion more than that. And the president is patting himself on the back for saying, well, we're not going to increase the debt by $20 trillion. We're only going to increase it by $17 trillion over the next decade by taxing and regulating the American people into oblivion. I would just ask the gentleman, last question here, and then we're going to, in a couple of minutes, I want to yield to my friend from West Virginia. But would it surprise the gentleman that we're spending $158 million in economic, law enforcement, and military support for Mexico? So again, the American people, you and I, we are funding to the tune of $158 million Mexico's law enforcement and military, while it's becoming a narco-terror state. Cartels are literally killing American citizens in Mexico, infiltrating our country, causing 72,000 dead Americans from fentanyl poisoning. This is the thing the American people don't understand. Does the gentleman agree?
So we're borrowing an additional $150 million to send it to a Mexico that is controlled by the crime cartels, right, so they can utilize that funding to invade our southern border with the individuals who are allowing to pass through their country, correct, trafficking drugs, human trafficking, sex trafficking, who knows what, hundreds of thousands every month, but yet we're going to borrow $150 million to send it to them to help them do it.
That's correct. And if the gentleman doesn't mind, I'm going to end here with a few minutes on the border and then yield to the gentleman of West Virginia, and I thank my friend from Virginia for coming down.
Thank you, Congressman Roy.
And so on that point of what we're funding, 4.5 million encounters of illegal aliens at the southern border since the beginning of the Biden administration, 7,000, 8,000 migrants crossing a day, 1.3 million gotaways, nearly 1.7 million illegal aliens released into the United States. That means we've released more into our communities than the population of at least 11 individual states. Under this administration, there's been surges of known or suspected terrorists at the southwest border. 0 in fiscal year 19, 3 in fiscal year 20, 15 in fiscal year 21, 98 in fiscal year 22, 53 so far after 1 quarter in fiscal year 23 of individuals that are affiliated with known or suspected terrorists at the southwest border. Last summer, 53 migrants died in a tractor trailer in San Antonio, which I represent, cooked in the Texas heat. And that is somehow compassion? 880 migrants have died crossing the U.S.-Mexico border in fiscal year 22. And that does not count the thousands that have died across South Texas and other places on ranches. Doesn't count the little girls sitting in stash houses as we speak, getting sold into the sex trafficking trade, while Mayorkas and Biden fiddle while our nation's borders are burning. Just last week, 4 Americans traveling to Mexico, one of them a mother of 6. They were attacked by cartels in broad daylight. 2 were dead, 2 are getting care. And we give $158 million to Mexico for law enforcement and military. This is why today I am reintroducing my legislation to designate these drug cartels as the terrorist organizations that they are, so that any individual associated with them that provides material support to a designated FTO would be sanctioned and could be pursued lawfully. Materials include, but is not limited to, providing weapons, safe houses, lethal substances. Representatives and members of a designated FTO would be subject to removal. Financial institutions could be targeted. But the main point is to make clear that these dangerous cartels are the equivalent of ISIS and Al-Qaeda right off our border, killing Americans, killing Mexicans, turning Mexico into a narco-terrorist state, giving China an avenue to get to the United States, to pump fentanyl into our communities. And this administration is doing nothing. And this Congress must not continue to fund a government that is at war with the American people, funding a woke, weaponized federal government that is undermining our freedom, undermining our prosperity, undermining our liberty. It is our duty as Republicans and all members of Congress to use the power of the purse to defund the executive branch that is tyrannically at odds with the well-being of the American people. And with that, I would be delighted to yield to my good friend from West Virginia and appreciate his great service to our country.